Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an ancient text to uncover how the framework you bring to the table can literally change everything about what it means. We're zeroing in on this intense theological debate between Trinitarian and biblical Unitarian scholars. We're going to look at how two totally different groups can read the exact same biblical texts and walk away with entirely different understandings of who Jesus actually is. It's a fascinating look at how we interpret data, and we'll be using the arguments straight from our source material to break the whole thing down.
So how exactly do readers of the exact same ancient texts arrive at completely different conclusions about the nature of Jesus? It's a great question, right? To figure this out, we're going to explore a modern critique of the traditional arguments for Christ's deity, relying strictly on the data presented in our curated sources. Now, our goal here isn't to tell you what to believe. We just want to show you exactly how these interpretive lenses work in real time. How does a framework shape what you see on the page? Let's find out.
We are going to logically unpack this in 4 steps. First up, the H.A.N.D.S acronym debate. Then, analyzing the name argument. Third, kingship in Hebrews 1. And finally, the gospel acronym framework.
Part 1. The H.A.N.D.S acronym debate, claiming deity. So our source material centers on a critique of this H.A.N.D.S acronym. In Trinitarian apologetics, H.A.N.D.S acts as basically the primary defense for orthodox views. The argument goes like this. Jesus receives divine honors, possesses divine attributes, is given divine names, performs divine deeds, and sits on the eternal seat of God's throne. According to this framework, if Jesus does things only God can do and holds titles only God can hold, well, he must be God, right? But the biblical Unitarian critics in our source material push back on this methodology pretty hard. They argue that it fundamentally misreads the ancient context.
All right, moving to part 2. Analyzing the name argument and the statistical disparity. Now I want you to pay close attention to this specific staggering number, 1,291. According to the source, the New Testament refers to the Father as God exactly 1,291 times. It is the overwhelming default usage of the word God or theos in the entire text.
And this brilliantly illustrates the Unitarian counter-argument. Look at that comparison, 1,291 times for the Father versus maybe 10 times for Jesus. If the authors intended to communicate absolute equality between the two, this massive 1,291 to 10 disparity seems to heavily favor a distinct separation between God and Jesus. The critics argue that if the ultimate point of the New Testament writers was to reveal a triune God, this huge statistical imbalance just doesn't make sense. Plus, they note that even those roughly 10 potential references to Jesus as God, they're highly debated by scholars and often rely on super complex punctuation or specific textual variant choices.
Furthermore, critics argue that ancient readers understood the title Son of God very differently than we might today. They didn't see it as a claim to ontological deity, meaning he wasn't claiming to be the creator God by nature. Instead, it was a highly recognized royal title for God's anointed human representative. Back in the 1st century, calling someone Son of God was basically synonymous with calling them the Messiah or the King of Israel. The source points out that during Jesus' lifetime, people weren't reacting to him as if he were claiming to be Yahweh walking around on earth. No, they were reacting to his claim to be the human Davidic king.
Which brings us to part 3, kingship in Hebrews 1 and the Old Testament context. This is a huge battleground for interpreting ancient titles. Trinitarians often use Hebrews chapter 1 to argue Jesus is called God and is given the seat of God. It says, "Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." But Unitarian critics are quick to point out that this is actually a direct quote from the Old Testament, specifically Psalm 45. And to understand Hebrews, they argue, we absolutely have to look at that original source material. Because here's the crucial point. In its original historical context, Psalm 45 was an ancient wedding song. Its poetic language was directed at a human Davidic king, probably Solomon or another monarch, on their wedding day, not some pre-existent divine being. The authors argue that if an ancient psalmist could use the word God in a secondary, hyperbolic sense to honor a human king who represented Yahweh, then the writer of Hebrews is simply applying that exact same royal language to Jesus as the ultimate human Messiah. The Unitarian model suggests that this all operates on the concept of proxy kingship. This is where human kings act as authorized deputies ruling on Yahweh's behalf. Just like King Solomon was said to sit on the throne of Yahweh, Jesus is honored as the ultimate proxy king empowered by God. And you know, this neatly explains why, even in that very same verse in Hebrews, God is still referred to as his God. He clearly has a God above him,
who gave him that authority in the first place.
All right, part 4. The Gospel Acronym Framework, a Unitarian countermodel.
So after playing defense against the H.A.N.D.S acronym, the Unitarian critics in the source transitioned to offense by proposing a very clear alternative. They developed the Gospel acronym, which presents a systematic view of Jesus as a distinct, empowered human Messiah. They argue this framework doesn't require any complex theological gymnastics to explain why Jesus has a God or why he doesn't know certain things. Let's break down each of these 6 points really quickly.
Given life by his Father. This means his existence is entirely contingent and reliant upon God as the ultimate source of life. Unlike the Father, who is self-existent and eternal, the Unitarian view highlights that Jesus was given life. He owes his existence entirely to the Father.
Next is O, which highlights his mortality. Offered his life for us. Offering his life was significant precisely because he was a mortal, flesh-and-blood man sacrificing himself. The source points out that, well, an immortal God literally cannot die. Therefore, the sacrifice means so much, precisely because it was a genuine, mortal human life being offered.
For S, they argue he is subordinate to God, meaning he's operating respectfully under the supreme authority of the Father, both functionally and in his very nature. The source points to texts where Jesus says things like, "The Father is greater than I," arguing that this wasn't just some temporary submission during his human life, but the eternal reality of his relationship as the human Messiah under the one true God.
Now, let's see how this builds with P. The P stands for peccable, which means he had the actual ability to sin. The critics argue this is absolutely vital. If Jesus possessed a divine nature that made it utterly impossible for him to sin, then his temptation was essentially a sham. Like a divine cheat code, right? But if he was truly peccable, his choice to remain sinless becomes a genuine, triumphant human achievement through absolute obedience.
Then we have E, signifying he was empowered by God's Spirit. The source references texts showing that God anointed Jesus with the Holy Spirit and with power. This means his authority to do miracles, heal, and forgive was delegated to him. It wasn't an innate divine attribute he just brought with him. It was given to him by the Father.
Finally, L points to his limited knowledge. The Unitarian framework suggests we should read texts where Jesus admits he doesn't know certain things, like the day or hour of his return, at simple face value. Rather than trying to view this through a lens of hidden divine knowledge or assuming he had a subconscious vault of omniscience he just chose not to access, this framework simply accepts that as a human being, there were things the Father knew that Jesus absolutely did not.
So as we wrap up this explainer comparing the traditional H.A.N.D.S framework with the Unitarian Gospel framework, it leaves us with a really provocative thought. It's not just about the text itself, it's about the lens we wear when we read it. Whether you see Jesus as the second person of the Trinity, possessing all divine attributes, or as the exalted human proxy king, empowered by the Spirit, your assumed theology fundamentally alters biblical history. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you read an ancient text, ask yourself, which framework are you bringing to the table?